Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. A Soul's Journey, Superlearning, Out on a Limb, Lucid Dreaming and Autobiography of a Yogi are just 5 of the books that ignited a deep curiosity and expanded consciousness in the mind of scientist, entrepreneur, modern yogi, and self-confessed simulated being, Rizwan Virk. A graduate of MIT and Stanford, Rizwan Virk is a successful entrepreneur, an investor, futurist, video game industry pioneer, indie film producer, and the author of several best-selling books in his own right, including The Simulation Hypothesis, an MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics agree we are in a video game. Treasure Hunt, Follow Your Inner Clues to Find True Success, Zen Entrepreneurship, and his latest book, Wisdom of A Yogi, Lessons for Modern Seekers from Autobiography of a Yogi. Rizwan Virk, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You do so much. I'm surprised you have any time to read.
Well, I end up listening to a lot of books on audiobooks nowadays. And you'll notice that many of the books in my list were books that I read, quite a while ago, actually. But now I reread some of those again and again.
Yeah. There's been so many changes in the way that we read books over the years that I wonder what's coming next. I don't know if there is anything more that we could possibly come up with to make the whole process a lot easier, other than just downloading the whole lot into our brains. But you'd know more about that than I would.
That's true. I mean, there are folks experimenting with, brain-computer interfaces, and those are among the stages of technology development that I listed in the simulation hypothesis for how long it'll take us to get to something like the Matrix. And if you remember in the movie The Matrix, there was a scene where they plugged him into a martial arts studio and said, "Suddenly, I know Kung Fu," right? So perhaps it's coming, but it's not here yet.
No, but at the rate at which things are, progressing, I should think it wouldn't be many months.
True. A few years, I think, for that one, but plenty of other things are coming more quickly than that, I think.
Do you think we'll ever say goodbye to the traditional hardback, printed books?
Well, if you watch certain science fiction like Star Trek, right, which is set at least several hundred years in the future, the old books are considered antiques, right? And in the same way that today we look at the books that were hand printed or early Gutenberg press books, right? Anything before 1900 is basically considered, a rare or antique or collectible book. But particularly when you go back kind of pre-printing press, those are very rare and unique. So, we may get some of that as things move more and more electronic, but I personally enjoy the feeling of a book in my hands. And so I will often have 3 copies of the book: the physical copy, the ebook for my Kindle when I can't carry the physical, and an audiobook for when I'm out walking or exercising. So,
Well, you developed a love of books quite early, didn't you? Your dad used to take you to the library when you were very small, and then you used to hang out there yourselves as you got a bit older.
Yeah, very much. So, myself and my older brother is only like a year and a half older, so we were, fairly close in age. My dad would just take us and drop us off at the library, and we would end up reading Sherlock Holmes or Encyclopedia Brown, kids books. And then as we grew older in high school, that's where I spent a lot of time. was at the library after school, and so some of the books here I discovered in the library, although many I discovered later after graduating from MIT. But I did spend a lot of time in the library, and so it's always a thrill for me when I go into the library and see one of my books in the library, and so
Mm.
it's just a visceral thrill since I spent so much time there, hoping that some young person will find my books interesting in the same way that I found so many books, and learned about so many authors, just from spending time at the library and browsing.
Yeah. You said that, when you were a teenager and you hung out in the library, that's when you discovered a lot of books on spiritual practices and traditions. What drew you to that particular stack?
Well, one of the books that I list in this top 10 list was Superlearning, which was a book, kind of a classic book. I mean, I haven't read it in years now, but I read it way back in the 80s when I was a teenager. And, it promised that you could learn thousands of words, within an hour. And, I was a junkie on just learning anything I could. And so I thought, hey, this is a way I can learn more. And of course, it led me into this whole idea of rhythmic breathing and pranayama, and that kind of led me to other books. So my favorite sections, were science fiction, of course, as a young boy and a Star Wars fan, which I saw in the theaters way back when. But also, as I started to look at nonfiction, I started to look around at different books, and several of the books on my list were either inspired by topics that I used to look at back then, as well as fantasy. I mean, I discovered J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings while I was in the library in the kids section at first, and I didn't read it right away. I read it a little bit when I got a little bit older, but that would happen a lot where I would discover a book, but it might be too advanced for me at the time, and then I might end up reading it at some point in the future.
Mm. Well, Superlearning is one of my favorite books, actually. And we will come back to that one a little bit later on because there's more to say about that. But let's start with one of our top, most frequently recommended books in the No BS Spiritual Book Club, which you put top of your list, was Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, published in 1946. When did you read this book?
Well, I first came across it probably, late 80s or early 90s when I was in school, in high school and then in college. But I didn't actually read it until a few years later. Excuse me. So it was probably around the mid 90s that I read it because it had been recommended to me by a meditation teacher that I was studying with at the time. And, originally I had seen this picture of Yogananda with his long hair and his bright eyes that many people have seen. And I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And I picked it up and I did read it. But then when I finally dove into it, I loved it. And I found that it was extremely inspiring, and that the book really opened up my eyes and mind to lots of other possibilities. And so, the stories in that book are pretty legendary now, and they involve swamis and sages in the Himalayas and across India, performing all kinds of miracles. And I know we'll talk a little bit about my new book, Wisdom of a Yogi, which is based on Autobiography of a Yogi. But this is one of the books that I found interesting because it didn't necessarily have any specific techniques, right? It didn't have a specific pranayama breathing technique or Kriya Yoga technique, and yet it serves as the gateway for many people into Eastern philosophy. And it was one of the most passed around books of certainly the boomer generation. And in the 60s and 70s, right, everybody had a copy of the paperback, the self-realization paperback copy that was passed around extensively. And so for me as a Gen Xer, my mentors were of that generation. And so they all passed down. In fact, a number of the books on my list, this being at the top of the list, were passed down to us. And I find today it's not so well known by a lot of the younger generation. And that's a shame. And that, we can talk more about that later when we talk about my new book. But it was Steve Jobs' favorite book. It was given away at his funeral a couple of years before he died. It was the only book on his iPad, according to his biographer. And so, for me, I found Yogananda trying to bring the ancient techniques of yoga into the modern world, right? Modern for him at the time, which was 100 years ago now, was quite interesting. But it's really those stories of these miraculous events that stayed with me, because I was in a very left-brained, science and engineering oriented world during that time, and running a startup first in Boston and then later in Silicon Valley. And it was nice to have somebody here saying, well, this is not all there is. There are other things that are possible, and to try to bring these different ideas of yoga, and not just the asanas, which has become very popular. And so for me, this is a book that I've gone back to and read every few years. Unlike some of the books on my list, which I read back then and they had a huge impact on me, but I don't always go back and reread them every year or every 2 years. I might take a look at them every so often. But this is one that I go back and I always discover new things, new lessons embedded within these stories. And it's the kind of book, because there are so many stories, like 500 pages of stories, you can always go back and you realize, oh, I never paid attention to that story. But that's really important, and it's speaking to me, at this point in my life.
Yeah. Did you ever listen to it on audio? I had the CDs, and it's very, very long, very long.
Yeah, in fact, there's the Ben Kingsley version that I do have as an audiobook. I did have the CDs at one point. Now I have it on Audible digital. So in fact, just the other day, because I had to revisit these stories in writing my latest book. I went back and I would listen to the audiobook again, and it's a great recording, a great version. I mean, you really see Yogananda as a kid trying to run away off to the Himalayas, or you see saints, in your mind's eye that are levitating or bilocating. And so even though there are spiritual lessons, I think it's this wow factor that really caught a lot of people's attention, and then it inspires us, onto whatever our path may be, right? Which doesn't necessarily have to be Yogananda's specific lineage. That's another thing that I like about the book, and also because he really bridged the gap between the East and the West, right? In a way that hadn't been done, right? His biographer called him the first modern yogi, or the first modern guru. And because he came here and he used modern methods and he ruffled some feathers back home in India by doing that back then. I mean, we think of Yogananda now as having been here a long time ago, but back then, he was kind of the new guy doing unconventional things. And I like to think if he was alive today, that's what he would be doing, is unconventional things.
Yeah. So book number 2, Saved by the Light, the true story of a man who died twice and the profound revelations he received, Danny and Brinkley, 1994.
Yeah, so this book made a real impact on me in terms of my thinking about life and the afterlife, right? And I first read the book back when it came out and heard Danny speak back then. Since then, Danny has become a good friend of mine, and so we've talked about a lot of these ideas. He's given me some blurbs and endorsements for some of my books. But the thing that really stood out for me, many people might remember, he was struck by lightning back in the 1970s, and he had this near-death experience that really had all of the classic elements of the near-death experience, right? He was outside of his body, then he saw the light, then he saw what he called beings of light, then he had a life review, and we'll come back to that, because for me, that was probably one of the most important aspects of his experience. And then he saw a city of light, and then he had these prophecies, and the book was a huge bestseller at the time. I think it was like #1 New York Times bestseller, and partly because of these prophecies that he had put in there, but he also died several times. And, the subtitle there was The Man Who Died Twice. If you talk to Daniel today, it's like he's died 4 times. And, what strikes me as sort of humorous, when I talked to him about it, he goes, because I know next time I'm dying, I got to go. And he has this, very thick South Carolina accent, which I love. And he goes, I'm going to have to face that damn being of light and let him know what I was up to. Right. and so, he introduced me to that idea of the holographic panoramic life review, where he had to review every single moment of his life in glorious 3-dimensional detail. And he also had to see it and feel it, not just from his own perspective, but from the perspective of other people. And, he was a bit of a bully when he was young. So he used to beat up, he was a big kid and he used to beat up other kids. And he was in the military and he actually shot people. And so he had to see what it was like to be shot and killed by himself. And then he had to see what happened to the families of those people that he had shot. And so this was a life-changing experience, right? In addition to all of the near-death experience, it's this understanding of how to treat people. And so for me, in a sense, that was my introduction to near-death experiences, which of course there are many stories and many books on now, and there are many great books about NDEs now that could just as easily, be on this list. But for me, I read this one first, even before I had read, Raymond Moody's books about the NDE, and because he had so many of the classic stages of the NDE, like they were all pretty familiar to me afterwards. And so, it's definitely a book that made an impact and continues to, because I do go back and reread it, and I talk to Daniel fairly regularly as well.
Yeah, I enjoyed that book tremendously, and I also enjoyed interviewing Danny. He is very, very funny guy.
I thought you might have interviewed him. Yeah.
Yeah. So number 3 is Superlearning, and I think there's a little bit more to say about this particular book because the authors Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder. This book was published in 1979. And you said it was one of the first spiritual books that you read. But I mean, this one really did kind of blow my mind. And it also introduced us to things like the Mozart effect and how music can affect the brain and how you can increase your capacity for learning by listening to Baroque music.
Yeah, and I remember, in high school, I would, turn on certain classical music that they recommended, and I would try the different breathing techniques. And, it really got me to understand this idea of states of consciousness, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That we can be in different states of consciousness, influenced by as simple as, our breath, or as simple as the music that's coming through. And I also was intrigued by the fact that they had gone to the Soviet Union at the time, and that was where they had learned about these techniques. And it just seemed like there was so much experimentation going on there, even more so than here. Like even the remote viewing programs were a response because they thought the Soviets were doing it. And so for me, it was also an eye opener that hey, there are other places in the world where they're perhaps doing even more innovative research, and they're not as closed-minded to these other states of consciousness and finding ways to utilize these states of consciousness. And for me, it was an invitation to kind of go deeper into how does music, how does breathing, right? One of the techniques that I learned, which is the simplest rhythmic breathing technique, you can do it. I still do now, right? Sometimes I've had like these health issues and digestive problems, and I've been in the hospital, and I just go back to these simple rhythmic breathing techniques, and it just restores balance in the body and gets rid of discomfort. So even though I went after it looking, more about learning, it was kind of these underlying aspects of what they learned that I think have had more of an impact on me. I mean, I can't say that I've ever used Baroque music and rhythmic breathing to learn thousands of SAT words, although I certainly tried back in back in high school before I was taking the SAT. But it had a big impact on me, and I haven't read it for quite a few years now. But it's fun reflecting back on it, and maybe I should go back and reread it again after all these years.
Did you read Sheila Ostrander's previous book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, which she published in 1970?
I did read it, and I have a copy in Boston, and I was just back in Boston this summer, and I saw it on my bookshelf, and I was like, okay, I really need to go back and reread that because I didn't remember too much of, because I only read it the once, and it was such a long time ago. It was probably 40 years ago at this point that I read it, but I remember there being some pretty amazing stories in there.
There was, I think they did an updated version called, no, that was Superlearning 2000, wasn't it? Yeah. But that particular book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, you talked about, these innovations that were happening in the East. There are so many different kinds of innovations reported in that particular book that will blow your mind. I mean, one particular I think he was a physician who was teaching blind people to see through their fingertips, through frequency. And the frequencies of colors, he was training them, because colors had a frequency and a kind of stickiness or slipperiness that they could identify. And through training them, some eventually actually began to see without using their eyes. So that's a good one to look at.
Yeah, no, and speaking, you had asked me about the library earlier. That's, I remember when I had first gotten Superlearning, and then I had asked the library, and we were living in a small town in North Dakota, so the local library was pretty small, and they had to call out for interlibrary loans to try to find, books that I was interested in, because once I started reading, I'd see references to these other books, and I remember they had to go out of state somewhere to find that specific book, and I do remember reading it back then.
Yeah. So book number 4, A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu, 1973.
Yeah, so this is not a well-known book, but I think it's an important book. And A Soul's Journey is sort of the modern title. It was actually, the original title of this book was From the Turret. And Peter Richelieu, I think he was in South Africa when he wrote it. And the story, it's a story, and he's in South Africa, and there's some yogi guru figure who says he's going, and it was during World War II, I think, who's going to show him what it's like to go out of his body. And he goes out of his body, and he finds his brother who had just passed away in the war, but he's alive and well, and he's doing things in the afterlife. And and then it goes on to describe various stages and places in the afterlife. And for me, it was just a vivid account of an expanded world, right? That I hadn't really seen before. Like, even some of the near-death experience books and some of the yogic books don't go into this kind of detail of what it's like to be in the astral and other planes that might be there. And so again, it's a story where there's a guru that's guiding him, and he does this, and it got me very interested in both out-of-body experiences, but also ways in which we connect over time. There were scenes of schools in the afterlife where people were speaking of music and Mozart, where they were making amazing music. People who were musicians who had died, who were on the other side, basically following their passions, but to a whole new level. Music of the kind that we couldn't even produce here on Earth if we wanted to. And so for me, this was really a kind of map, if you will, of the afterlife. And I was introduced to this book by Robert Moss, who appears on the list a little bit later. And we were doing a shamanic dream work group, and he had recommended it, and I'm so glad he did. And again, I find not many people know about it. And recently I tried to find an audiobook version, and there wasn't one. So I tried to track down the publishers and where the rights were to see if I could just produce one and publish it. And it was just so murky that I couldn't find anybody, couldn't find the rights. So that I think this has kind of disappeared. There are folks republishing the book, and it is available now on Amazon, like the physical book. But hopefully we'll see an audiobook version at some point, because it's just a great journey to follow.
Yeah. Number 5 is Journey of Souls, Case Studies of Life Between Lives by Michael Newton. This one comes up quite a few times as well. A lot of people have read it. This one was published in 1994.
Right, and you'll notice a pattern here where several of these books were published in the 90s, because that's when, for me, that's when I really started my spiritual journey in earnest, after I had graduated from college. And so, this book was really eye-opening, because, I talked about the afterlife, but this book is about kind of the bardo, or the in-between state between lives. And he had such vivid descriptions from his patients that he'd hypnotized of what they went through during that time, and different soul groups. And, there was a particular section that really caught my attention. Right. And I do go back, and even though I haven't read the book in a few years, I often go back to just reread these sections. And one of the sections was that there was a life planning room. Right. And in this life planning room, you see the potential life that you have plant, right? So you plan with a guide or whoever's there with you, what you might do and where you might go. And he described it almost like a computer control room where you could see paths diverging, where you might make major choices and they might go in different ways. And just this idea that we were planning the life with other people. And there was another section right after the life planning room where you could look at what might actually happen. This inspired me a lot and played a role, both this and the holographic panoramic life review. So this is kind of like a life preview. And then the life review both inspired me quite a bit in writing my book, The Simulation Hypothesis, and linking it to ideas of what happens after we die, what happens before we're born, before we play a character or an avatar. So it was almost a direct correlation in my thinking between these two books from the 90s and the stuff that I'm writing today that, the younger generation finds interesting because it's about video games and uses a video game analogy for that. And so then after the life planning room, there's this cramming room where you basically present little clues with other people to say, remember, this is how you'll find me in this life. Right? I mean, someone might say there's a certain, silver amulet this little girl's going to wear. And when you see that, you're going to be intrigued by it and you'll know she's going to be important in your life. And, earlier we were talking about, my partner, Ellen McDonough, who's an artist who did this painting behind me. And she and I always joked that we had set up these kinds of little clues for ourselves so that we would recognize each other when we met, which was back in the 90s during this time. And so that book made a great impact on me and still does to this day.
A friend of mine calls that planting the crystals on your path, and that you find these crystals as you move through your life, and they're all meaningful.
Yeah, and I think last time we talked and when I was on OMTimes was when I wrote my book Treasure Hunt, which was all about following these types of clues. And so I pulled in, quotes from Journey of Souls into that to talk about how some of these were planted before our life and others are perhaps more dynamic, pointing us at particular futures with whether it's feelings of deja vu, synchronicity, things that happen to us in our dreams. Yeah, that's great.
Well, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview and sharing the 10 books that had the biggest influence on his life journey is scientist, entrepreneur, modern yogi, best-selling author, and simulated being, Riz Virk. We'll be back with more of Riz's. Your name is very difficult to pronounce altogether, but we'll be back with more of Riz's 10 best spiritual books after this brief break.
OMTimes TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting OMTimes Media's flagship radio show What Is Going On and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit Sedgbeer.com. Click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's Sedgbeer.com, SEDGBEER.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. OMTimes Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, OMTimes offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an OMTimes magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on OMTimes TV and broadcasting it across the extensive OMTimes radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. OMTimes. Open yourself to the possibilities.
I wanted to talk to you about a program called the Dream Arc and a retreat that we're doing, and I want to invite you along. And the Dream Arc is a dream technology, and even the latest physics is suggesting now that reality is not what we think it is, that it's kind of a construct, and that the Dream Arc teaches us how to use the full operating system to navigate our brain frequencies between waking and sleeping and dreaming, and to move through the inner realms and the outer realms seamlessly. And you will work in the Dream Arc with certain animals that will come to you, maybe in real life, maybe through your intuition, in magical ways, or perhaps through, just dreams that come to you. It's filled, the Dream Arc, with invitations and suggestions and tasks that you choose intuitively. You choose the ones for you. You don't know what you're choosing, but they come to you. So please join us as we dive down the wormhole into the Dream Arc, and let's see what happens.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Rizwan Virk, book number 6, Take Off Your Glasses and See, a mind-body approach to expanding your eyesight and insight, by Jacob Lieberman. Another one published in 1995. That was a great decade.
It really was. And, we had talked earlier how I spent a lot of time in the library, particularly as a teenager. And it was there that I had first come across books about vision improvement. And, I had first gotten my glasses back then as well. And I became intrigued because and I'd always ask my optometrist, hey, I read about this thing in the library where you can do these exercises. And they'd be like, nah, that stuff doesn't work, right? And so I became curious. And there was even a book that had been written by somebody called The Yoga of Seeing in India, based on the Bates method. And this book came out in the 90s. And, since then I tried some of the eye exercises, but hadn't necessarily succeeded. But this book, to me, reframed the whole discussion of what it means to have, whether it's myopic vision or farsightedness. And so for me, the book was about eyesight and improving your eyesight. But sometimes he talked about how it would happen almost spontaneously with people. And it was less about the exercises and the techniques, and it was more about how you held stress in your body and the fear and the flight or fight response that your body goes into. And that made a lot of sense to me, much more so than just the physical exercises, that it's about who we are, and all of our experiences shape us. And so in a sense, even though this was a book about vision improvement, and I had, a lot of improvement at various times, and much years later, I started doing certain types of relaxing yoga that had the same effect that he was talking about. And even though I do still wear glasses now, about 10 years ago, I was able to pass the California driver's exam, without my glasses at the time. And it was because I had been doing, the stress release yoga at the time. And even though then you get back into the stress mode when you get busy and you get busy with life, this book really opened up for me that possibility, that it's really about how we hold our energy in our body more so than it is just about the physical after effects of that, which might be vision, might be other things, but that there's an effortless way to go about doing things in life. And that was pretty intriguing to me.
Yeah, it is a fascinating, but all his books are fascinating. He's been writing a lot about light and what we don't know about light and how it affects us, and how, living with so many artificial lights is affecting our vision as well.
Yeah, and I know he talks a lot about light in his other books as well. And so he was a real visionary, and continues to be right to this day, I think. I've never met him in person, but I hope to one of these days.
Book number 7, Journey to Ixtlan, by Carlos Castaneda, published in 1972.
Well, one of the difficulties with the top 10 list or 10 best or 10 most influential books in my life is that there were more than 10, right? And so it's difficult to choose. And, as I mentioned, many of my mentors early in my spiritual journey were of the boomer generation. And of course, Carlos Castaneda was, a big influence on them. And, he was called the godfather of the New Age movement and was on the cover of Time magazine when his books came out. And for me, I ended up choosing Journey to Ixalan as what he had, like 6 or 7 books that starting with the teachings of Don Juan, and probably Journey to Ixalan or The Art of Dreaming were the two that made the biggest impact on me. And I chose this one just because it's the clearest for somebody coming in to read Castaneda today. Again, Castaneda is one of those that is perhaps not so well known by the new generation today. But I was intrigued by his stories of going to Mexico while he was still, an anthropology student at UCLA, working on his PhD. And to me, that was quite interesting because he lived in this left brain academic world, and yet he would make these journeys down to see Don Juan. And there are a number of lessons, but he really influenced my ideas about both living this dual life, because I was starting to live a dual life myself as an entrepreneur during the day, working with venture capitalists and engineers, and then in the evenings and on the weekends, I'd be shuttling off to try these different spiritual consciousness techniques and workshops and study with different teachers. But also, the dream world, right? I mean, he introduced me to the idea of lucid dreaming, and with the exercise, but also that you can change your attention and you're building something called the dreaming body, right? And it was just a tradition that I wasn't familiar with, right? And of course, he's a controversial figure. Some people say he made all, Don Juan up, and some people say no, he didn't. And my guess is the answer is always somewhere in between. But this book made a great impact on me because it was so much fun to read, and because of this idea about the dream body and how you can go places with the dream body. And that influenced me quite a bit. And even my first book, Zen Entrepreneurship, which is about being in the business world while having a spiritual mentor, was very much influenced in style and tone by Castaneda. And so he continues to have an impact on me, although I don't read his books as much anymore. But I do feel like they need to be rediscovered by a new generation, because they fall into that super popular at the time, and now people know about it, but not as much. Yeah.
Book number 8 is a book that you say has become a metaphor for your adult life, and it's Out on a Limb by the wonderful Shirley MacLaine, the godmother, I think, certainly of the New Age movement or the Awakening Consciousness movement. And of course, this one was published in 1984. What a brave lady she was.
She really was. And before I had read the book, I, like many others at that time, probably saw the miniseries that was on TV. And in a sense, this was, I forget what year it came out, but it was in the 80s, the miniseries, 87. But it was around the same time that I began reading Superlearning. And I was looking into, these other areas of consciousness. And for me, it was just an eye opener, right? And, talk about living a double life. She would be off dancing, right, on stage in some exotic location, or the show. And then the next day she would be out seeing a channeler, right, in, Sweden or wherever it was. I forget which country it was. But, and so to me, her ability to describe what it was like for her to be living this double life was really interesting. And she had lived a very public life, right? And so it was intriguing to me that she was such a public figure, and yet she had this whole other aspect of her. And this wasn't even her first book, right? She had written about her career before that, but this is I think her first real spiritual book that really got into past lives. And so, I remember the scene, from that I saw in high school, where she was in South America in this pool and she left her body. And so for me, it was very much the first concrete introduction to what it would mean to have your body leave your physical body, your spiritual body leave your physical body and go out. And I remember looking at that and thinking, can that really happen? Right? Does that really work? Right? And irrespective of the alien stuff, which I've become much intrigued by recently. I'm an advisor to the Galileo project at Harvard, for example, and I'm kind of involved in the UFO world. But kind of well before that, I became interested in this idea that we have multiple bodies, and you'll see that thread through several of these books. But watching the miniseries originally, and then later, reading the book was a real eye opener for me, and had a real impact. That you can be a very successful person in one field and also have this other side of you, and you don't have to hide it, right? And that for me, that was a bit of a struggle, right? When I wrote Zen Entrepreneurship, I was worried, what are all my venture capitalists and my colleagues from MIT, what are they going to think, right? They're going to think I'm crazy, right? And I just wrote a sequel to Zen Entrepreneurship, which hasn't been released yet, where I talk about my experiences going to a channeler in the 90s in Boston. And that part I had left completely out of the first book because I thought it was just too out there for a lot of people in the business world. So I thought she was a courageous lady, and I really appreciated her book and her miniseries, which I think got a lot of people to open their eyes to things they might not otherwise have been open to.
Yeah. Number 9, Dream Gates, a journey interactive dreaming by the very, very inspiring Robert Moss.
And so once again, just picking one of his books was difficult for me because he's written many inspiring books about dreams. And so Robert Moss was a mentor of mine, and I spent a lot of time with him on his shamanic dream retreats. And it was really there that I learned about the whole process of shamanic journeying and using a drum beat to help you get in the alternate state, right? If we go back to Superlearning and using Baroque music and rhythmic breathing and yoga using pranayama, now we have the indigenous traditions. And I didn't know much about different indigenous traditions and their link with dreaming. And so through his books, I became, intrigued, and I was interested in lucid dreaming already because I had already read Castaneda's books, and I didn't read Robert's books until a little bit later. I think it was in the 2000s. And Dream Gates was the first one that I bought, but I hadn't actually read it. And it had been sitting on my bookshelf, and there was a whole series of random coincidences where I said to somebody told me to, learn about you should learn about shamanic dreaming. And I looked around, and the only guy I found was this guy in Albany, New York, and I was living in Boston, and that's kind of far. Then I looked on my bookshelf, and I realized I had 2 of his books that I hadn't actually read. And, it was that kind of led me to read his book, Conscious Dreaming. He has an approach to conscious dream work. And this idea of bringing in the energy from a dream into real life, dream theater, honoring your dream, so many different aspects of what he teaches are important. I think he also, inspired my book, Treasure Hunt, which is about synchronicity and dreams, because for him, those two go hand in hand, right? And then that was really kind of, where I learned to pay attention to both of those things together. So I was very inspired by Robert Moss's books. Dream Gates itself is a book of different, what he would call locales, like stable locales in non-ordinary reality. And you can use these images to travel to these places. And so I found that an intriguing concept as well. And I just love Robert. And he's a great guy. And he's done so many books now about different aspects of dreaming and why it's important.
So the final book, no surprise, after what we've heard, is called Lucid Dreaming, and it's by Stephen LaBerge. And he actually published 2 books with that title, with 2 different subtitles. So I didn't know which one you were referring to, because one of them was The Power of Being Aware and Awaken Your Dreams, published in 1985. And the second one, published in 2009, was subtitled A Concise Guide to Awakening in Your Dreams and in Your Life.
Well, it was definitely the first one because I read it back in the 90s. Right. So probably couldn't have been the 2009 version. And so, for me, what was interesting to me about dreaming was that there were all these different traditions that have their own take on dreaming. And I like to say dreams are probably one of the most important subjects in the human world. And in almost every spiritual tradition has some relationship with dreaming. Like with Castaneda, it was interesting. He was trying to tie it specifically to the Yaqui traditions, that he was learning. And with Robert Moss, he had deep connections with the Aboriginal traditions as well as the Iroquois, where he lives up in upstate New York. And I spent a lot of time, studying the Tibetan dream yoga traditions. And it was interesting that to me that Stephen LaBerge at Stanford, right, at the Stanford Sleep Lab, they were doing experiments on this weird aspect of consciousness, right? And having spent time at MIT with researchers, they're not always open to these types of spiritual experiences. And so in the same way that yoga has become popular today in the West, in a sense, by stripping it of its spiritual value and focusing on the practical health benefits, right? There's yoga studios on every corner now. It seems like Stephen LaBerge was able to kind of step back away from the different interpretations. Like in the Tibetan dream yoga traditions, they have their own techniques for lucid dreaming. But it was interesting that he was providing Western techniques, things that we could use to try to induce this state of lucid dreaming. And yet there is this great spiritual relationship, because when you wake up from the dream, if you wake up inside the dream and you realize it's a dream, and it's something that I did a lot of, particularly back in the 90s, I would do a lot of lucid dreaming where I would fly around, and I had lots of interesting experiences, and I write about some of them in my very first book, Zen Entrepreneurship, which I've mentioned a few times. But he also inspired, some of those experiences, because it was a matter of each of us finding our own, way into lucid dreaming. And even though I've read many books on lucid dreaming and on dream yoga and on the dream body, this was one of the first that I read along with Castaneda. And so it continues to be important, even though, I haven't gone back and read it in a long time, because I've just been practicing these various techniques from many different worlds. But I included this in the list because it really did make an impact and showed me there's some scientific basis for this. And part of my work in this life is to try to bridge the gap between these different worlds. And part of the reason I wrote Simulation Hypothesis was because it finally provided me with that framework where I could talk about spiritual things with scientists and they wouldn't poo-poo and dismiss it. And I could talk with people who were Buddhist monks or, Christian Gnostics or Islamic Sufis. I just gave a talk. I was in the UK in Manchester. I gave a talk on Islam and the simulation hypothesis. And I talked about leaving the body and entering the body, which was inspired, going all the way back to Stephen LaBerge and these other books. But I talked about it from the perspective of the Quran and Islamic tradition. And, there was an Ayatollah from Iran in the audience. And they said, and then it was like I was kind of giving these guys new metaphors and a new language with which to talk about this stuff. And so I think, we all who are interested in the subject owe a debt to people like LaBerge for making this a respectable subject and trying to look at it from a scientific point of view.
Yes, that is the end of your list. In your keywords, you use the phrase about yourself as a bridger of fields. And I think that as we're seeing the science and spirituality get closer and closer, those fields are not so far apart and the bridge must be getting a lot shorter.
Well, and on the one hand, they're not that far apart. On the other hand, they're also continuing to get farther apart. So this is what I see from spending time in academic circles and with scientists. Even though there are now, many scientific experiments, right? The Princeton experiments around quantum randomness to show that mind might impact things. At the same time, we still have a very strong materialistic kind of philosophy and point of view and almost dogma within the sciences, right? That if it can't be measured by our current level of instruments, then it doesn't exist, right? And I see that, within the UFO world as well as within the spiritual consciousness world, although they've become more open to, again, by stripping some of the spiritual stuff of its spiritual significance, like mindfulness. They can measure, does that relate to, reduced stress? How does it relate to reduced blood pressure? And so there have been inroads, but at the same time, they'll dismiss out of hand anything for which there isn't a clear materialist explanation. And so with neuroscience beginning to understand the brain, on the one hand, it's provided us with some very interesting links. On the other hand, it's provided a much more of an ammunition to the materialist to say consciousness is just these neurons. And eventually we'll figure out what every neuron is doing. We're not there yet, but so it adds to the materialist fire. And in my view, even though there are elements within science that are bridging these closer together, in general, they seem to still be moving further apart, and they like to push stuff off as the world of religion, and this is the real world of science still very much. And so I've seen it as part of my vision, to help bridge these different worlds, because even the most ardent atheists, once they think about the simulation hypothesis, the idea that we are inside a video game, they kind of admit, well, if that was true, then anybody outside the simulation would look like a supernatural being. So maybe I should be an agnostic as opposed to a staunch atheist, right? And that was part of the reason why I wrote that book, was because I could, basically spend time with all of these different groups of people and try to help bridge that gap.
Well, certainly from where I sit, and my job is looking at where science and spirituality meet, and the interviews I do on those subjects, I am seeing more and more books being published and being written by theoretical physicists who are now saying, exactly what we believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is, as I said, there are more and more people who I think are starting to see the connections.
Yeah.
At the same time, there appear to be more that are also not, interested in the connections. It's just a weird duality that I'm seeing from where I sit within the academic community. It's not that they necessarily, it's sort of like a blank stare, like that's not a relevant subject, right?
Yes.
And then it can become relevant when you talk about quantum mechanics and the observer effect and the weirdness of that. But even that, one of the reasons why many physicists are uncomfortable with the observer effect is because it involves consciousness to a certain extent. And the first thing they'll tell you is, no, it's not really observer, it's a measurement. And so, well, somebody has to read the measurement, don't they? So you still have to have an element of consciousness. Yeah. And so, so they're looking for an out, right? But I do agree there are more people that are open to it, just in terms of numbers and in terms of people who really think these things through. But at the same time, we have sort of a militant atheism too, that has gotten pretty strong, and so I still feel like the worlds need more bridging to be done. But it's not that there aren't people doing the bridging; it's that bridging isn't necessarily getting out there fully. I think yet.
So tell me about your book on Yogananda. Your publisher asked you to write this. Why did they pick you to write it?
Well, so, I got an email from editor HarperCollins India saying that it's the 75th anniversary of Autobiography of a Yogi. And, we don't want to just do another reprint of Autobiography of a Yogi. We want to write a book about lessons that people have learned. And we think you should write it. And I said, are you sure you want me to write it? I mean, yes, I'm a huge fan of Autobiography of a Yogi, and I had referenced Yogananda in my books, in the simulation hypothesis. And I had written some, when I was sick a few years earlier, I was sitting on the couch for a while. I had nothing to do. So I reread Autobiography of a Yogi, and then I wrote a couple of blog posts about why the book meant so much to me. And I wrote some posts about what to read after Autobiography of a Yogi, if you're interested in stories of miracles in the Himalayas, etc. And, they said, well, we wanted to appeal to a more modern audience. We like the way that you use, modern terminology, whether it's video games or computer technology, and the fact that you've been in the world. And so, for me, one of the lessons in this book is sometimes the universe gives you a task, right? And this was a task that I wasn't planning to do. And yet when I thought about it, I got this electric feeling in my body, which I think is a clue that this is a path that I should follow. And it made more sense to me because, Yogananda, one of the analogies he would use modern analogies in technology. When he came here 100 years ago, he used the metaphor of the movie projector. Right? He saw newsreels of World War I, which was called the Great War at the time, and there had never been killing on that scale using machines before. And he said, Lord, why do you permit this suffering? And he got a very clear answer while he was meditating before he came to America. And the answer was, what are life and death but relativities in the cosmic dream? Think of the newsreel you've seen. All these scenes that you're seeing played out are a play of chiaroscuro. And I didn't even know what that word meant. I had to look it up. It was an Italian art technique where you use shadows, light and shadow. And so he would say that the world is made of light, like a movie projector. And you no more die than the actors who play a character in a movie are dying. And so you see a play within a play. And so this metaphor became really powerful. And he would say, you have to look away from the screen. You have to look at the projector that's coming and the light. And if you've ever done that in a movie theater, I used to do this when I was a kid. Like I was watching Star Wars, I'd be so engaged. But every now and then I'd look around and you'd see like everyone is so engaged in a movie that they've forgotten about anything else, right? They're forgetting that they're in a movie theater. And it was very much like the veil of forgetfulness, the river of forgetfulness we crossed when we incarnate. And then also, if you look away from the screen, you can see the flashes of light for each frame, in a way. You can see them changing. And if you're engrossed in the screen, if you're engrossed in Maya, right? And Yogananda talked about, how the warp and woof of the material world is Maya and illusion, and science is telling us that as well. And so he was a bridger. He was a bridger between the East and the West. He's the first kind of Indian guru who really set up residence in America and had an impact. But he was also trying to bridge different religions, which is why you see a lot of the Bible quoted in Autobiography of a Yogi, along with the Vedas. And Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but he was also trying to bridge modern science in his time. And so I came to believe that if he were alive today, he would say that the world is like a movie made of light, but it's an interactive movie, and we're all the actors, but we're also watching the movie, and we have a script, but we can change it. What does that sound like? It sounds like an interactive, massively multiplayer online role-playing video game, in my opinion. And so it kind of made sense to me that that could be a new way in for people. And there are many people who haven't read that book, Autobiography of a Yogi, who would like to understand what it's about. And I had folks in India who, right now it's a bestseller in India. It's available at the bookstores at the airports, like on the bestseller list. And, they've emailed me and said, well, I read it, Autobiography of Yogi. It was too big for me. I didn't get into it. But now that I read your book, I see why it was so important. I'm going to go back and reread those stories that you talked about specifically, in the book, because there are a lot of lessons, karmic lessons.
Yes.
And I try to use stories from my own life as well as Yogananda's life. When Yogananda came to the US, he was not the best choice to come and speak at the Congress of World Religions, where he spoke in Boston in 1920. He was a young Swami. He'd rarely ever lectured. He'd never given a lecture in English, right? And yet this task was placed before him, right? And that was his task in this life, should he choose to accept it, which he did. And he came here and he kept at it, and he made a huge impact. And so we can use the lessons both from within the book and the stories of the miracles, but also stories from Yogananda's life, and look at modern stories and realize that it's still just as relevant today as it was when this book came out in 1945 or 46.
Which of your books did you enjoy writing the most?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. It's kind of like asking which of your children.
I know.
I'd say certain books are more personal than others, right? This book was very personal for me. I tell stories from my life that I hadn't told before. I talk about the setbacks in Yogananda's life, which he did not necessarily write about in the autobiography. And I talk about my health crisis that I had, where I had spent my time in the business world, and at the height of my success, I had to have heart surgery, and I had this health crisis, and it completely knocked me off of the track that I was on. And I realized there were aspects of my life plan and mission, which was to write more books, that I was moving along slowly. I'd published 2 books in 10 years, right? And because I was so busy doing other things. And within 9 months, I had published 2 more books, including the simulation hypothesis, which became my best-selling book. So, in a sense, this was the most personal book because I really dug into my own life and that of my father as an immigrant. Yogananda had to take the first boat out of India after World War One, which they called the Great War, because they had stopped all service to get here. And my father was coming to the West from Pakistan, and he was delayed because of the war they had between India and Pakistan at the time, and he had to take the first flight out in order to arrive while he was working on his PhD. And so there's a lot of personal elements in this book that weren't necessarily in my previous books. But it's hard to say which one I enjoyed writing the most. But this one was definitely a lot of fun to write because I love stories of, there are stories of jinn, of a Muslim fakir, holy man, controlling an entity, which I would say is like a jinn in the Muslim traditions, who can make objects appear and disappear. And so then I started to do some research on, okay, is this just a story Yogananda is telling us to teach us a lesson? What are we to think of these stories? Did Babaji really live for not just a few hundred, but almost 1,000 years? And is he still alive today? And so I started to do research on that. So for me, that was a lot of fun, and I had a personal vision while I was visiting the Encinitas Hermitage, which is where he wrote. So Yogananda, after having a huge setback when his organization kind of fell apart, went to Mexico and meditated and said, Lord, please let me go back to India and forget this stuff in the West. It's just too hard to be here, right? And convince these people that yoga is important. And the answer was, no, this is your task. You need to keep doing it. And so he started to look at different ways rather than traveling around the country all the time, which is what he had done in his first 15 years in America. So he spent much of his last decade in Encinitas in San Diego, overlooking the Pacific Ocean at that hermitage in his office, writing Autobiography of a Yogi. And so he found, right, it was the setback that got him to look for a way to make sure his message got out there. And so I went there, and I had my issues because it was during COVID and it wasn't open to the public. And luckily SRF agreed to give me a private tour. So I was able to go in and spend as much time as I wanted, with a few of the monks that were there in his office, which is preserved just as when he wrote it. And while I was there, I had a very strong vision of him. I mean, with the sound of the waves coming in, you automatically get into a meditative state. And according to the monks there, it's not unusual for people to feel his energy. But I had a very clear vision of him where he was standing there and he had this stack of papers, which of course is how they wrote the books back then. They didn't write them on a computer. And he kind of looked at me mischievously and opened these French doors out to the patio of the Pacific Ocean. And much to my horror as an author, he threw these pages out there, like to let them scatter to the wind. I was like, wait, what are you doing? Right. But then, he said, look, and then each of the pages turned into little birds. Right. And these birds carried his little white birds that carried his message all around the world. And he was giving me a message about part of my mission in life, which was to be a writer. It was part of my life plan, and I was just now getting on with it at this point. And about our words will survive us, and also don't take it so seriously. Don't hold on so tight. And that's when I decided, well, I'm just going to write about the stories in Yogananda's book that I like, which were a lot of these stories about the miracles. And then the book just flowed from that point forward. And so that was an experience that I had. So that was definitely a fun experience. And writing this book was definitely a fun experience.
I can imagine. You are currently doing a PhD and teaching classes at the College of Global Futures and the Fulton Schools of Engineering at Arizona State University. These strands of your life, the gaming, the investing, the engineering, everything else that you're doing, academia and the spiritual side, are they drawing closer together? Do you talk to your students about some of the other things that you do?
I do. And it's because, I mentioned earlier, part of the reason why I wrote the simulation hypothesis was because it brought these strands of my life together. Right. I had spent time in the video game industry and then as an investor in many video game companies. And I had spent time, at the Monroe Institute doing out-of-body experiences and all of these different things. But I was able to kind of pull it together. And so the video game metaphor provides a way to discuss, particularly with students, how things that seem like they're impossible, like spoon bending in the Matrix, right, how this is actually possible. And so one of the classes that I teach now, I can't talk about this stuff in all of the classes, but one of the classes that I teach, I got to design myself. In fact, the only 2 classes I teach now are classes I designed myself. And it's called Simulation Theory, Technology, Science, Philosophy, and Religion. So that's about as interdisciplinary of a class as you can get. And so in that class, we start to think about what it would mean if we were made of pixels. Would in a video game, because these students, they play video games, they know that world very well. They know what it's like to be an avatar in a game world. You can send messages to your friends that don't appear in the physical quote unquote world, which is the rendered world, right? You have a friends list, which I then try to tie to this idea, like in Journey of Souls, where you have this kind of group of souls that you've made some agreements with and people that you might communicate with and you might meet in your life. This idea of quests and achievements, which is how you play video games. You choose a quest and you don't always succeed, but then you play it again. And then you go on, and when you complete a quest, you unlock more difficulty. And so I do try to bring these ideas, into my teaching. Now, of course, in academia, certain things are very narrow and it's harder to do, but certainly that class gives me the opportunity. And, when I talk about far out subjects, it's easier for me to do it than other people because, heck, I already said, I think we live inside a computer simulation, very publicly at Google and other places. I've been out there saying that for years. So it's not that weird for me to be talking about some of these other things, whereas other professors wouldn't go there necessarily.
So, final question to you. You've met some of these authors, Robert Moss, Danny Brinkley. If you could have dinner with any one of the others, who would it be?
I would probably say Yogananda would be the one.
I thought you might.
It's number one in my list, but also, I think he's been gone the longest, and I would ask him about some of these stories, right, that he talks about in India, because I'm quite curious about these. And yeah, I think it would be Yogananda would be the one.
Yeah, I'll join you for that one.
Absolutely, we'll have to do it on the astral plane, I think. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Go traveling in the dream time. Riz Virk, thank you so much for adding your 10 best list to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
Thanks so much for inviting me to do it, and great to be here with you.
So, Riz Virk's 10 best list can be found at the NoBSSpiritualBookClub.com, and you can learn more about his books, including his latest, Wisdom of a Yogi, his blog, his services, at his website, ZenEntrepreneur.com, where you can also download free chapters of his books. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Riz Virk.